We are Clay and Susan Griffith. We're the authors of Vampire Empire, the Greyfriar, from which we'll be reading this evening. Book 2, which just came out, The Rift Walker, and Book 3, which is in process and will be out next year. We are a married couple who write together. We've been writing together about 15 years, and we've been married about 15 years. We anticipate staying married. And we hope to continue writing. I mean, we have control over one, but not necessarily the other. And this was originally going to be a comic, but as I started developing it, this was before we were collaborating, I thought, wow, this is really good. This should be a novel. And I wrote early drafts and premise, and it just didn't hold together, it didn't work quite right. So many years later, after Susan and I had worked together on some other things, we were looking for a new project, and I said, yeah, I got that vampire thing that I messed with a couple of years ago. Why don't you look at it and see if you can fix it? So I gave it to her, and she looked at it, and she fixed it. And it got published. So that is the story of Vampire Empire. She recognized that I don't know anything about women. And that my female characters were notably weak. And she fixed that, because the lead, it's a two-part lead, male and female. And the female lead is quite strong and needs to be. And I didn't have it, but she did. So that's what I have to say.
She's a princess. She's on the cusp of becoming an empress of one of the greatest human states. And I think she couldn't be weak. She had to be like Queen Elizabeth, you know, someone who just sort of started out, but is over the course of the book is going to be given the hands or possibly in line to be, you know, the next ruler. And those aren't weak characters. And you know, I'll admit it, I'm a Buffy fan. I'm a fan of women who are empowered, who are not going to be, you know, the damsel in distress. And that is, you know, I grew up in pulps, and so I love male adventures. But my biggest gripe is all the women in those characters, in those books, never came to the forefront. They were used as just caricatures, and I didn't like it. So to us, when we were writing this, I mean, pulp was one of our biggest influences. And so when we looked at the female character and we were re-evaluating her, it absolutely had to be something that was not a damsel in distress.
The shorthand that our publisher likes to say is it's Buffy meets Zora. But in a steampunk setting. So that's what we have to say now, and I think, are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right.
The Greyfriar, Chapter 1. Your Highness would be safer below. It's getting dark. Vampires are very unpredictable. Thank you, Colonel. I believe I'll stay on deck a bit, yeah? It's quite warm. That should keep the beasties quiet, yes? Princess Adele noticed a slight smile on the dark, chiseled face of Colonel Mehmet Anhalt, who stood close to her, as was his habit. Under her gaze, the short but powerfully built Gurkha officer covered his bemusement by clearing his throat and offering his brass telescope. In that case, Your Highness, would you care to have a look? Yes, I should. Thank you, Colonel Anhalt. Adele crossed the quarterdeck of the HMS Ptolemy and leapt with girlish pleasure down 3 steps to the ship's waist. A crowd of red jackets from her household guard parted to make a path to the port rail. A stiff breeze rolled a heavy skirt around her calves and whipped the ends of the scarf that struggled to retain her long auburn curls. Adele snapped open the telescope and steadied her booted feet expertly against the airship's sway. The distant clouds were turning brilliant orange and bruised purple in the darkening eastern sky. 5 miles off the port beam, Adele spotted 2 figures floating, silhouetted in midair. Vampires. The young princess felt a delicious thrill spread through her. Vampire cadavers were displayed occasionally in the streets of her home, Alexandria, and she had even viewed the purported preserved head of the clan chief of Vienna, but she had seen only a few living specimens in her days. These 2 lay spread eagle on the air, vibrating in the drafts that buffeted their nearly weightless frames. Adele felt a tinge of horror when one turned its head and she thought stared at her, looking her in the eye with its cold glare. She closed the glass with a sharp breath, going pale. Frustration swept through her that the creature should startle her so. It was not as if the beast had truly been looking at her. It merely had been looking at the ship. Struggling to regain her composure in front of her guardsmen, she resumed strolling the quarterdeck. A young boy suddenly exploded up out of the main hatch. His face was red from the exertion of racing up the companionways, as indeed he raced everywhere he went. He was barely 12 years old, and still round-faced as a baby, with darker hair than Adele's cropped short. A flowing, striped Cotoouan Bedouin robe over breeches and sandals made him look like a ragamuffin from the alleyways of Cairo. He scampered to Adele's side, shouting, "I heard there were 2 of them out there." Princess Adele cut a very different figure from her wild younger brother, Simon. She was the heir, the future empress, and her very proper traveling garb was chosen for reasons of state. Today she wore a heavy cotton shirt, a leather jacket with a Parisian sash, and a long velveteen skirt covering high leather boots. In the sash she had her prized weapon, a jewel-hilted kukri, a broad-bladed dagger that had been a gift from her mother. More, it was a Fahrenheit blade with chemical additives in the scabbard that gave the steel an intense chemical heat when exposed to the air, making it more destructive than a normal blade. Prince Simon's urgent voice interrupted Adele's thoughts. "Do you think we'll meet the Greyfriar out here?" Adele shook her head with confusion. "What? The Greyfriar? What in the world are you talking about now?" "The Greyfriar! He's a hero who fights the vampires in the north." "Oh, yes. No, of course not. He's not even real, Simon. Just a story to make people feel better." Simon narrowed his eyes at his sister's ignorance. "He's not a story. He's real. I saw pictures in a book. He carries swords and guns and wears a mask. People say he killed 100 vampires in Brussels. 100! The young prince began to wave his arm around as if he had a sword, striking and slashing. "He's a master fencer with all blades. His swords move so fast, vampires can't see them. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Their heads are rolling before they even know the Greyfriar is there. Ha! Colonel Arnold, you believe in the Greyfriar, don't you?" The soldier said over his shoulder with mock solemnity, "Indeed I do, Your Highness. I heard he killed 100 vampires in Brussels, too." "You see, Adele, I told you." Adele replied, "Simon, be still. Why can't we meet him? I bet if we told him we were coming, he'd meet us. We're the royal family of Equatoria." "We can't see him because he's not real. Now stand still and mind me." Simon huffed. "Well then, will they let me command the ship?" "No, of course not," Adele snapped irritably. Then she blinked and said more softly, "Not now. Perhaps tomorrow." Simon wandered from her side, intent on exploring the ship's wheel, where blazingly bright copper pneumatic tubes gathered to form something like a Baroque organ. Prince Simon was due to become an officer in the Imperial Navy, and this idea excited him. Colonel Anhalt coughed commandingly at the young prince as small hands played over the pneumo tubes. Adele darted from the rail and grabbed her brother's arm. "Simon, don't get in the way." I'm not going to hurt anything," the boy retorted. They were interrupted by the clack of a pneumo arriving from the tops. With his back straight, Colonel Anhalt said to Simon, "Would Your Highness care to retrieve that signal from the chief of the top mizzenmast?" With a yelp of joy, Simon lifted a round copper flap, and a rubber cylinder dropped into his hand, along with a splash of dark liquid. "Ew! What's this?" He lifted his stained fingers into the yellow light. Oil or grease, Adele thought with mild exasperation, automatically reaching into her pocket for a handkerchief. Anhalt stared at Simon's hand with furrowed brows. He pulled the pneumo-cylinder from the boy's grasp and sniffed it. "Blood," the rough-shouldered soldier murmured. Abruptly, his stern visage turned on the horrified Prince Adele. His voice was firm and demanding. "Your Highness, take your brother below, if you please." Adele put one hand instinctively on the hilt of her dagger, and with the other tugged Simon toward the main hatch as Colonel Anhalt gazed up at the vast dirigible 100 feet over his head, as if trying to see through it to the invisible topmasts above. Several naval officers were on the quarterdeck, who stopped chatting amongst themselves and watched with growing interest. Suddenly the airship lurched. Adele grabbed a pneumatic tube for support and pulled her brother back to his feet. In the rigging high above, she saw a figure tumble sickeningly, flipping this way and that, unable to grasp a safe hold, until he shot past the deck into the black atmosphere below the ship. Before Adele could understand that sudden tragedy, another man fell, and then another. Then she saw strange, shadowy things moving with unnatural agility down through the lines, pulling hand over hand toward the deck. Two dark, cadaverous figures settled to the deck amidship with no sound and lifted their blood-stained faces into the light.
Anyone have any comments, questions? Sure.
James, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about what your process is when you're doing an audiobook. Do you read it first and decide on what the characters' voices are going to be, and then when you're reading it, how do you keep them all straight? Do you record all of one character's dialogue at once, or how do you remember? Do you have to have yourself played back to you, or?
No, I just leap off the cliff because I want to be carried along as an observer of the story as well. I find that emotionally, for me, it's better if I get caught up in it and don't cut it up technically. I do practice the voices, like the Gurkha officer. Like, I was thinking it would not sound very good if it was in here. So I went for Ben Kingsley and Gandhi.
It worked. That's exactly his voice. Exactly.
But yeah, as I go through it, like some of the stuff. It seems like it's easy. Like the English stuff was like, okay, that'll be cool, and Adele made sense to me right away. She reminded me of strong characters I read in the Dresden Files. What's her name? The officer.
Karen Murphy.
Yeah, Murphy. She reminded me like the young Murphy. Yeah. And then just trying to decide how to keep her separate from Simon, who's prepubescent, and so he still sounds very much asexual, and I just thought, well, it's attitude. That's how that's going to be played, and just stuff like that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I've just got really more of a statement. We just, in May, took a haunted ghost tour of Scotland, and we went to Edinburgh Castle and to Greyfriar, and I just wanted to say your descriptions were wonderful, and it just really took me back a couple months ago, so thank you very much.
So that was a huge reason for writing the book. We were actually married in Greyfriar.
I read that when I started, yeah.
That's why the character's called the Greyfriar.
Yeah.
I have a question for James.
Go ahead. Grill him.
Was there any hesitance in doing this, because although it's a double feature with two characters, much of the point of view is from her.
Yeah.
Any hesitance on taking a book that's heavily female-driven?
At first, when I started reading it, I was like, uh-oh. But then you got into all the history and stuff. I was like, oh man, I'll work that out. It's really cool. It was so cool. I was like, oh, we'll make it work. And also, I did a lot of female characters for the last series, so I was like, I always go back to Shakespeare because like they always ask how could a man back then write women that were so well-rounded? And the thing is, Shakespeare was a humanist, which is his philosophy was that we're pretty much the same human beings. And so he wouldn't write female characters. He would just write human beings. And then he would cast really good-looking transvestites to play them. And it works. Yeah.